Good evening. My name is Angela Laporte, and I am the current Director of Art Education at the University of Arkansas School of Art. Welcome to the first of two Art Education in Action lectures during the spring semester. This lecture is sponsored by the Walton Family Charitable Support Foundation and the Art Education Program. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional homelands and territories of the local indigenous peoples, including the Osage, Caddo, and Quapaw nations, where the University of Arkansas is currently located. A portion of the Trail of Tears runs through this campus where the Cherokee, Choctaw, Muskogee, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations passed through during a forced removal. By acknowledging the past, we recognize our responsibilities in relation to ongoing settler colonialism that eradicates indigenous peoples, cultures, and languages, as well as those colonial projects that dispossess indigenous lands. This statement is an invitation to recognize indigenous presence now in our communities and to reckon possible ways to support the indigenous survivance. At this time, I will turn over our guest introduction to Dr. Camacho Valencia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Laporte. 1 second. Here we go. Okay. So it is my pleasure and privilege to introduce our guest speaker today, Silvia Inés Gonzalez. Silvia is a multidisciplinary artist, cultural worker, and educator in Chicago, creating spaces where collective wellness takes on critical dialogue, art making, and community building. Her visual and audio work is a ballad to nostalgia, the borderline between myth and memory. Silvia has curated and facilitated workshops to address structures of power, imagination, play, confinement, and freedom. Her work has been exhibited at the National Museum of Mexican Art, Women Made Gallery, Hyde Park Art Center, Acre, and local grassroots art spaces. She is a member of the Chicago Act Collective, Multiuso, and the 96 Acres Project. As an organizer for the group POC, People of Color Artist Based, she connects artists from color from across Chicago to resources through meetups, salon sessions, and development opportunities. Silvia Gonzalez went to the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and received degrees in photography and art education. She has a master's degree from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where she wrote a thesis on the work done with the 96 Acres Project. Her action-based research engages community knowledge and grassroots justice work in the classroom, where young people are encouraged to consider the ways in which artistic intervention, storytelling, and education become multiple and interconnected points for liberatory departure. She was awarded the 3 Arts Make a Wave Award in 2018, CAC and Other People Pixels Maker Grant in 2020, the Chicago Art Department Residency Artist for Community Award in 2022, and the Illinois Humanities Envisioning Justice Grant in 2022. In addition to all these wonderful accolades, I am so proud and happy and lucky to say that Silvia is a dear friend and co-conspirator as a fellow member of the Chicago Act Collective, and I am so beyond excited to have Silvia speak with us. I know from a direct experience that I have learned a tremendous amount from Silvia's work, pedagogy, and practice. So without further ado, I will go ahead and turn it over to Silvia.
Thank you, Dr. Camacho. I really appreciate that introduction from both you and Angela. I'm really excited to have this invitation to share space with all of you and to talk about my practice, because I think even hearing like my own like statement back, like it's very apparent that the 2 major components of my practice are around storytelling and community. So I think that co-creating a space of reflection with you tonight is the intention on my end, and I'm really excited to be able to do this together with you all. So I wanted to start off first today with inviting folks that are part of this meeting today to create a 5-word story. So you can take a look at both of these prompts and choose the one that resonates with you for creating a 5-word story. And the prompts are: what brought you to teaching/education? Maybe you're not necessarily involved in teaching, but you're thinking about education broadly. And the second thing that I put down as a prompt as an option is to tell a story of the time an educator had a profound impact on you. What made it profound? So let me talk a little bit about the parameters of what a 5-word story is. I'm going to provide 2 examples. So for the first one, what brought you to teaching and education, I wrote down to reflect and be reflected. Sorry, that was definitely 5 words and I counted 4, but that's 5 words to tell one story in 1 sentence. For the second option for the 5-word story, I wrote down moving and then 2 points, no fear to fail. So from that, I could expand more on both of those 5-word stories, but we're going to start just with a 5-word story. For giving you time, I'm going to put a song on so folks can just kind of like think for the duration of the song, which is approximately 3 minutes. And as you come up with your 5-word story, if you could drop it in the chat box, that would be great. So I'm just going to temporarily stop sharing my screen and I'll pop it back up once I have the music going. But take some time right now to create your 5-word story. We'll have about 1 more minute before the song's over. All right, well, it's nice to see some of the responses in the chat box. I'm just going to go ahead and read what I saw. Who decides what's worth knowing for prompt 1? Take your time, my time. Hey, Lucia. Connecting with people across generations and backgrounds. Our bodies and experiences belong. Finally seen and heard. Value. Art class was my sunshine. If the 5-word story comes to you a little bit later, I encourage you to drop it in the chat box. That's just, I think, a really poetic and nice way to get us thinking about our stories. There might be something in there that somebody else said that resonated with you that you're like, I'm really curious about that. I think one of the driving factors in my work is definitely curiosity. And I think that's always a good entry point to better understanding people's story. So when I read To Reflect and Be Reflected, I think about how as an educator, I grew up in Chicago for the most part. I did live in León, Guanajuato in Mexico for some time, but when I came back to the United States, I was placed in ESL classes, and that had an impact on my learning. For those of you that are not aware of what that means, it's English as a second language classes. Now they're called ELL, English Language Learners classes. And I think a lot about how as a teacher, I want to be able to reflect and be reflected. And I see that in my approach to curriculum and in my approach to relating to young folks, and also acknowledging that we all come with our stories. We all come with different parts of our lives that have had an impact on who we are. Our spaces, places, and people have impacted who we are. And for me, it's really a powerful thing to be able to make space for whatever it is students want to share within that framework, whatever they feel safe and comfortable sharing within that framework. So I've been a teacher now for over 10 years, and I've had the privilege of working in at a lot of different capacities, really, in institutional spaces, in academic spaces, in gallery spaces, organization spaces, after school spaces. Chicago Public Schools is where I work now and have been for some time. I've worked in private schools, and I think that all of those different structures have really, really informed my approach to teaching, and I hope that you guys can kind of see how that looks. But I think that teaching in community and teaching in all these different ways informed even my own practice as an artist. I also maintain my own artist practice in addition to being an educator full time. And I think that I'm seeing a lot of ways in which I'm able to bridge and cross connect those identities and bring it either to the classroom space or to the community space. Now, in terms of how I approach education, I always also think a lot about questions as a side of curiosity. And when I pose questions, I'm not necessarily looking for definite answers. A lot of the time I'm looking for questions that invite other questions. And I think that, again, comes from a place of curiosity. For tonight, there were 3 what we call essential questions that I wanted to focus on, and then some sub questions that follow with those essential questions. And those questions include: 1, how do we create spaces where students feel comfortable interrogating systems and structures of power and their place within them? What role do play, care, and responsibility play in our learning spaces? How do we embody values that allow for the wholeness of our humanity to be met where it is? What stories do we invite to make present? And what role does art education play in liberatory practices? I want to hone in on this idea of community and this idea of what co-creation looks like, especially when we're thinking about interrogating power dynamics. And I broadened it to really consider learning spaces, because I didn't just want to cite the classroom as a space. I really wanted to think more broadly, like what we can consider a learning space. So, in case you haven't realized, I am a very participatory based practitioner, and I wanted to think through with you what it is that makes a community. So there's 2 questions here for us to consider. 1, what makes a community? And 2, think of a time that you felt part of something meaningful. What invited that feeling? And I want to invite folks for the next minute to type your answers into the chat box. What makes a community? I guess what I would say is like, don't overthink it. Like when you hear the word community, what does that mean? How do you create one? What does it look like to you? And if you're a bit stuck, you're like, I don't really know how I can define community. The second question invites you to think of a time that you felt that you were a part of something meaningful. How did you arrive at that feeling? What invited that feeling? So I'm going to give us about a minute to think through these two questions, and feel free to answer which one you feel most comfortable answering. But I am inviting folks to unmute and also to share your answers in the chat box. And I'm just fixing my window so that I can type in your answers as they come in. You can go ahead and shout it out. I won't bite. You can also drop it in the chat box.
Hey, I was looking for the raise hand because that's usually my mode for before I pop in. I think with the question of community, I feel really lucky because someone has asked me this before, so I've had a chance to like think through it a bit. But I think that with community, there's like layers of proximity, intention, and unintention. So like I'm in like a really intentional close proximity relationship to my roommates, and I'm trying to be very intentional about like being in a reciprocal relationship of like care and thoughtfulness. But then I think about the people that I'm in like unintentional proximity to, which might be people in my neighborhood that I haven't met yet before, or even I think about like a community of like the animals that I'm around, who I'm in very much like unintentional community with. Like I saw a woodpecker today and I'm like, wow, I haven't thought about how to be a good neighbor to you before. Yeah.
Gracias, Lucia. I appreciate that. So I'm also seeing some answers being dropped in the chat box. Thank you for those as well. Feeling a level of trust and space for communication and vulnerability. So I would summarize that as 3 key feelings: trust, should have brought my glasses, space of communication, and vulnerability. Thank you, Carmen, much appreciated. I'm also seeing people and more than human kin make up community. I'm also seeing relational dynamics, trust, relational dynamics, trust, vulnerability again came up. Deep connections are formed as a result, right? Sibella mentioned respect. I'm gonna put, well, actually that is kind of like an invitation. And I always unpack respect with students because that looks different for different folks with different needs. And I think learning to communicate that is also part of the process. Plurality of ideas and experiences. Oh, thank you, Lucia. That's helpful. Oh, thank you. Open dialogue. Excellent. Excellent. Yeah. Thank you all so much for sharing those answers. Again, like I did before, if at some point you want to add something that you think is relevant, you're welcome to drop it in the chat and I will try to check in and see if folks write things. So far we've accumulated some ideas around community and what it means to feel part of something meaningful. Layers of proximity, intention, reciprocal relationship, thoughtfulness, proximity, more than human kin, plurality of ideas and experiences, and invitations for those feelings of community include trust, space of communication, vulnerability, relational dynamics, deep connections, respect, and open dialogue. So I'm going to continue, and I just kind of want to emphasize this conversation that I just had with you. I have with my students in the beginning of the year to establish what intention do we want to move forward with, because I have routines and procedures that are just kind of like a standard to keep us safe and to keep us in relationship to one another in this space. But how do we want to move forward? And I really try to emphasize this idea that we are a team and it takes a team to make the dream. So how do we make that? Because a team for me is like part of a community, but arriving at community is a little bit deeper. It's almost like we're not just learning to work together, we're building a space together. And a lot of what you all mentioned is definitely, some of these points were brought up with students too, like respect, being able to communicate your needs and learning how to communicate your needs, especially at the level at which I teach, which is K through 8. A lot of the time students are learning how to voice their concerns in a way that feels right to their bodies, or voice what's happening or what they need. And sometimes I have to provide them with multiple options to be able to access what it is that they want to communicate. But I think that definitely these conversations are how you begin that process. So I very much appreciate you all sharing. Now, another part of once, we have an idea of establishing community and that intention, I pulled up this slide that I did with another program where I worked with Young Cultural Stewards, which is a Chicago Park District initiative here in Chicago. And I got the chance to work with young folks for 2 days. That's not a lot of time. And I had to find a way to establish some form of trust, some form of communication so that we could expand on ideas of power, to create a series of artist books around what it means to mend, heal, and transform community. So one of the things that I engaged young folks in was the practice of theater of the oppressed. One of the reasons I rely on theater of the oppressed in community work is because Agosto Boal has mentioned how theater is not the revolution itself, but it is the rehearsal for the revolution. And one of the other points that he brings up in his writing that I really appreciate is that we need to move away from this idea of spectators to spect-actors, meaning that the audience is sort of like undone. We are no longer just an audience. We really got to consider ourselves when it comes to justice and movement work as spect-actors, people that are actively engaged in the very topics that we are trying to address. So I use a lot of play in my interactions with young folks, and I emphasize on this idea, but I also am really blessed to be able to just witness play happening on its own without much direction. And I think that's a result of that sort of reciprocal respect that you all mentioned as well, that reciprocal like desire to be in a community of play with one another. These are some of the projects that you'll see me talk a little bit more in depth throughout this presentation. So this was just like a nice little teaser to what you're going to be seeing. Another part that I think is really important in the work that I do is, it's so awkward. I'm going to quote myself now, but I am going to read something that I was reflecting on as a practitioner that was also used as part of Small is All Young Cultural Stewards documentation. We cannot imagine just futures without our youth. We need their contributions and stories as central to the hive work of change. It is also essential that we examine how we engage learning practices to address structures of power as we do this work with young people. Play invites a kind of embodied vulnerability, a possibility for co-creating how we want to relate with one another. When I do theater of the oppressed games or any form of game with any group, be it young or old or in between, I always tell folks, I want you to engage at the capacity that you want to engage in, that you need to engage in. We may be doing these exercises, but if at any point you want to step back and observe, observation is another way of participating. And in that way, like I want to create multiple entry points for young folks to be able to access the learning and give them a place and space to feel like important contributors to the dynamic. So when I was thinking like, what would be the most useful way to really begin approaching how I talk about my work with you all? And I started thinking like, all right, well, how do I start teaching? Like, how do I start the school year? How do I start a 10-week program or a 1-week program? What are the different elements that stay consistent? And I sort of arrived at this, but I want to also emphasize this is not like a stone cold method. Like, it's not like I always, bust out this list and I'm like, all right, it's not a checklist, but it is a model that has remained flexible and adaptable to different spaces. And it definitely provides me an arc to consider the work that I'm doing. So one, how am I building a space that invites curiosity for getting to know young folks? What are the objectives that are being established by me in terms of like things that we're going to learn together? And how do I take youth voice to create youth-centered goals? That for me is really important. And my students today know that I listen to their requests. So if I have a curriculum and it's drawing, I open it up and ask them, what else would you like to do with this concept? And if they tell me clay, I tell them this weekend I will be lesson planning so that for the next 2 weeks, we're doing clay-based projects. 3, I think about the different ways, again, this is sort of going into differentiated instruction of how do I make multiple access points to highlight engagement for folks to be able to approach that element of community building. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like as we continue. 4, and I put a little star here, researching content, and you'll see why I put a little star there in a second. And then 5, creating, collaborating, interpreting, and reflecting. I want students to be a part of all of these different elements. There is never a moment when I don't think that their perspective shouldn't be a part of it. And they know that. They know that because I tell them, your perspective is critical to how I plan my lessons. I don't start planning. It would be easier for me to plan the year ahead on my own, but they know that I genuinely plan based on their responses, based on their feedback. That's part of my practice. So when I talk about researching content and I use the words data evaluation and application, I feel like a lot of folks are like, whoa, 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 like, we don't like these words, like they're not free, they're not liberatory, but I would beg to differ. And I really think that this is sort of a way in which I approach this is for you to do the work. This is the part that I do feel falls on the educator to do the work. It's not, I think it's actually part of the joyful work of getting to know students better. And if I could like sort of codify these words differently, honestly, I think it's really like getting to know your students, getting to know your content, and being able to understand how these will be applied to creating works of art. So you can kind of see how I broke down data evaluation and application. What do I know about students and what do I want to learn from them? Evaluation, what voices are being shared through the content? And for me, it's really important to expand on Black, Indigenous, POC voices because the majority of the students that I teach are Black. The second major population is Latino, and the third is white and Asian. So CPS as a whole, like when you look at the breakdown of the demographics, it is predominantly Black, Latino, with students who are from working class families. And so I really genuinely believe that my curriculum has to first and foremost be based on sharing multiple voices from these perspectives. Secondly, are these stories relatable to students' lived experiences? And if so, how am I going to move this content forward for multiple entry with methods of differentiation? Different learners need different approaches. Different people need different days need different things on different days. So how am I allowing the content to allow that? And that leads to, are my objectives wide enough for both depth and breadth? Are they going to be able to dive deep in their own storytelling development? And are they also going to be able to understand the larger picture? And then lastly, I need to identify what are the 3 to 5 key identified takeaways. Like, what are the 3 to 5 things that I definitely want to be able to step into with young folks? And again, this is all based on student feedback. This is all based on conversations on community that we also started this conversation with. So now you can kind of, we can finally get into the fun part, which is like talking about how this looks in developing youth work. How has this looked for me as an artist? How has this looked for me as an educator? And it's been a really wonderful privilege to get invited to work with young folks as an artist. So it's an opportunity for me to put on my artist hat in a little bit more of an intentional way than just my educator hat, like that daily CPS teacher, 8:15 to 3:15 hat. It feels a lot more loose. I feel that I'm trusted in a different way than I am as a full-time CPS teacher. I'm being approached to think like an artist with young folks. And I think this has been one of my takeaways for how I continue to approach my work in CPS. In 2019, I was invited by the artist Adela Goldbard, as well as Gallery 400 at UIC, to develop a series of projects with young folks from Tepochcali here in Chicago's predominantly Mexican, Latin American neighborhood. And the students came from Little Village and Pilsen. And the topic was around, again, community. What feelings, colors, events, things, people come to your mind as we learn about justice related to the community. Let's treat you as an expert. You are the expert. What do you want people to know about your community? What's important to you about it? So again, I don't know if you can tell, but like tons of questions, and then finding ways to pick them apart every session, finding ways to engage the body in movement work, finding ways to engage art practices for multiple access points. So here's an example of me taking photographs of youth working and youth researching the sounds of their community, and also creating these really beautiful blue, oh my God, why am I blanking on the word right now? Cyanotype style prints, finding objects in their neighborhood, creating like these little tiny wire sculptures to then expose on the blue paper, to think about how these objects literally take space on cyanotype, but then also to think about how more broadly these objects are a part of their community. How do they perceive what takes up space? And having those questions from the previous slide as a part of the conversation. And I just really like some of the tender moments that happened. And because they knew that I am an artist, they saw me as an artist. Like they knew that I was photographing, they knew that I was like just trying to get the light right, trying to make sure that, you know, they were being perceived as the experts, because they are. And you can kind of see a lot of like really just, I consider these really tender moments happening between young folks and the spaces that they're a part of. I'm going to take a minute and just kind of let this play for you all. If it does, I don't know now. Now the sound's not working. Give me 1 second. Okay, there we go.
Say something. Say something. No.
Silvia, we lost the sound.
You lost the sound, you said?
On my end, maybe it was playing for other folks, but after the second say something, I lost sound.
Were other folks able to hear? Okay, let me pull it up as a different file. I had it backed up, so we're good. Let me just pull it up for a second. And then please let me know if you hear it. I'm gonna be real sad if it doesn't work. Let me try one more time.
Say something. Say something. No. I am from the wind brushing my hair ever so lightly.
I'm from Pilsen and playgrounds.
La 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 la.
I am un corazón, full of love and compassion, but a rainstorm, falling teardrops in form of cloudy rain.
I am from the sound of congos being played at a salsa concert.
I'm from Pilsen and art. I'm from Chicago full of sound. My home smells like lavender candy. It feels like a home you're not alone in. It tastes like brick and wood and cement. I am from the Mexican Independence Day celebrating El Grito Month.
So that was like at the time, just so you know, like part of my practice is installation work and having multiple components for people to be able to engage with these different art practices. So for the exhibition at Gallery 400, I had the photographs of the youth working to collect sounds. I had their cyanotypes strung across the gallery space in the section that their work was in. And I had the audio pieces that people could put headphones on to listen to while looking at the photographs. And I know that the young folks were really excited about how am I going to put this all together? What is it going to look like? And being able to show them like the different processes of how do you put together a piece that can work individually, but also works collectively as a community. This is how it looks. This is how it works. Everybody brings different sites of expertise. Some people really enjoyed the writing component. Other people preferred recording sound. Other people preferred being the initiator of sound. And then I put together these different sound elements and I showed it to them. And the day that I showed it to them, they were like, oh my gosh, we did that. That was us. And I was like, yeah, you spent, X amount of time recording these. It's just a matter of like, how do we piece it together to create like a sound experience on community and what that actually means. So when we talk about community, we're really thinking about the sounds, the colors, the sites, the different ways in which we engage. Again, multiple entry points. Different people are able to access differently. And it was really my job to figure out what that looks like. I'm gonna go into now my work in CPS. Thank you, Paulina. And I'm gonna just, this is a project that's still in progress, but it has similar approaches. And I've been practicing multimedia practices with 8th grade students that involve weaving, photography, and now painting. And obviously CPS, very different framework. I have to sort of find these, like, be able to cite what it is that we're doing in a very different way. So here are the different things or the different core standards that we were meeting as a result of doing this project. I decided to just provide you with the exact same slideshows that I was showing my students and the questions and things that we're thinking about, and how are we going to interpret these things through our artistic practices. One of the artists that we're focusing on for this project is Maria Gaspar, who is a local Chicago artist from Little Village that does work around issues of incarceration, but also deeply personal narratives around identity. And I showed students this slide. I showed them Maria's bio, and we unpacked what it meant to address spatial justice. What does it mean to amplify, mobilize? How does she do this work through her practice? And then we hyper-focused on an exhibition that she had at the Mexican Museum called Brown Brilliance, Darkness Matter, where Maria essentially took archival media from the museum and wove it together with different images from the museum, or wove it together with images of her family. So we talked a little bit about the literal weaving and interweaving of our stories with and just like archival objects related to our identities, but then also like taking away, right? What does it mean to erase a place, and why would we do that? What is important in building and what is important in removing? And then I arrived at this quote, which is a much more deeply personal image of Maria's, and unpacked this quote with students, had them read it and think about it. And what I ended up having students do after going through all of this like research stage of the work was, okay, we've looked at this. Now you're in charge of taking photographs that unpack how you want to be perceived, and how does space impact your story. Not only space, but like, how do you want to be perceived more importantly? So you can kind of see like this quote and this particular slide really guided the work that students were invited to do after this. So I'm just going to very quickly read the quote. Going through images of my family, there was this print of my parents. They're in front of Grant Park by the fountain. It was 1963 and they had just arrived from Mexico. I love this image. It's something about the way they were standing, immersed in this new city. They were young. My mom was probably 19, my dad was 21, and they were smiling. Maria Gaspar pays special attention to histories, both social and personal. Historical narratives, she believes, can come back to life when infused with a sense of creative fluidity. The ultimate form of freedom is the ability to reimagine. So we then took this work, looked at multiple artists who are also approaching identity, also approaching the autobiographical work, and how they're doing that. So now we're thinking a little bit more about like, how do you translate stories? How do different artists approach the translation of stories? What stories are they trying to tell through their art? What are they trying to talk about when it comes to their race, class, sexuality, and gender? How are they approaching these topics through their art? What is it again about decontextualizing and recreating a new meaning through the use of art that allows us multiple entry points? Now, here are student art pieces from that. Step one was to take photographs rooted in the idea, how do you want to take up space and how does space impact you? So I had them practice low angle versus high angle photography. I had them think about getting up close, moving away. I had them thinking about the different spaces that we're part of. Now, if you notice, I blocked off part of their faces just out of precaution, but you can see that students took these photos. One of the things that they've noticed me do at school is sometimes I get called to take photos of our shows. And one day, one of the students was like, Ms. Gonzalez, can we do an art project where we learn how to take photos like you? I said, bet, we'll do this next week. Let's go. So it was really wonderful that part of the initiative, a large portion of the initiative came from students telling me, we see what you do, we want to know how you do what you do, and we want to do what you do. So that was quite, like a really big moment for me to kind of think like, why haven't I done this with them? I've been introducing them to all of these different artists, but why haven't I more intimately allowed this to happen? And this was just a really powerful moment where they literally took my camera and took these photos based on the different prompts that I had given them. Now I kind of just get to show them off. And we're sort of at this stage of the project. How are we weaving narratives? If students did a low angle photo, meaning they were looking up at the subject, I asked them to write a letter to their future selves. If people were at a high angle, I had them write a letter to their younger selves. I also had them write a love letter to Chicago. How has Chicago informed who they are? Similar to Maria's family and parents. And you can see how students wove that narrative within their photos, which created an abstraction, an opportunity for them to then reflect further and think about what it is that they want to say. What story do they want to tell with their photographs? Because I said this project is in progress, I've had them experiment with their photos, collaging them, decontextualizing them, playing with mark making, playing with different materials, revisiting the same image to recontextualize it, and also provide each other feedback. And this is where we're at now, students creating these collages based on their identity, based on what they want to communicate about who they are, what worries them, what excites them, what makes them nervous. Right now, we're in a really critical reflection component of the work that we're doing. The next part is going to be recording their stories, and the final part is going to be sharing their work with our school community through a presentation of a big art show at our school, kind of like, think of it as an exhibition opening for K-8 art. And they know this. They know that their work is going to matter outside of the classroom, which definitely ignites a lot of that emotion and desire to create and knowing that people are going to be listening to their stories and that their stories are critical and important to our school community. So I'm gonna take a pause there because I feel like now I'm like, oh my gosh, that was a lot in like a little bit of time, I feel like. But just to clarify, because I saw this question in the chat box, I work with students K-8 right now full time. The work that you've seen from the Puchcali was predominantly 6th grade to 8th grade. And the work that you saw just now is with 8th graders. So I'd like to open it up. I can also pop the slideshow back up and if people want to take a look at it again, but I wanted to open it up to questions, comments, or any feedback that you might think would be fruitful for our conversation.
And as you gather your questions, you can feel free to use the raise your hand option or just go ahead and chime in. We're a small enough group that if you have a question or a comment, you can go ahead and jump in and ask. I guess I can start if other folks are collecting their ideas. And I think you spoke to this a little bit, but I'm curious to know a little bit more from you. Where and how do the different roles that you embody, how do they navigate according to the different spaces, right? So as an educator, as an artist, as a community-based practitioner, how do you see all of these varying roles? Where and how do you see them intersecting and connecting, and how do they inform one another?
Gracias, Paulina. I think that's a great question because it's a big guide for my approach. I see it as like really fluid. And I think seeing it as fluid has helped me open up and expand to how I present that to students. And I think obviously working in CPS, there's a very different structure and I have to sort of abide by this very particular structure. But the fact that my students were like, we want to do what you do. Like, we want to get to know you as an artist. We know you as Miss Gonzalez. Like, let's teach us what you do as, Silvia Inés Gonzalez, so to speak. And I think that was a moment that was like, again, like a light bulb moment, because I thought that I was doing that a lot with them because I'm so much about co-creation, that moment was like, oh, you want to see me as an artist now. Like, you want to see me maybe a little bit more attached to that identity. Let's figure out what that looks like. And then realizing like how much excitement we were sharing with one another over like photography made me realize like I want to bring more of myself to the classroom space this year. And the fact that I have like this big show exhibition with K-8, like the whole school essentially, I'm excited to be bringing a little bit more of myself to each classroom. As a teaching artist, I think that bringing myself as an artist is a lot easier just because the requirements are very different. I feel like I'm trusted in a very different way, that I don't have to like, do all this, like, I don't want to call it busy work, but do all of this back end work and provide proof in all these multiple ways. Like, I can just focus on sharing my work as an artist and emphasizing the fact that I am a woman of color practicing in Chicago and focusing on what it is that I'm doing and building. And I think that definitely gives me more time to build in a very different way. But because I've worked in multiple spheres, I've been able to figure out, like, how do I do this? How do I make the work like abundant and like generative for me? Because I feel like you kind of have to in education, like you have to make it joyful for you just as much. Students feed off of your joy. They see you. Like, the students saw me photographing and they were like, we see you. We want you to see us with you. And I think young folks are always watching. They're always watching. They see what brings you joy. They see, when I talk about artists and a lot of these artists being my friends, they get more excited about the content and curriculum. So I don't know if that answered the question, but like, yeah.
It did, thank you. And I had a follow-up question, if no one else has one. Yeah, go ahead, Lucia.
Oh, I've been unmuted this whole time. Wow, I could have said anything. Dr. Camacho, if your follow-up question directly like continues that train of thought, I would rather continue that versus like take it off to a different place.
I was going to lead us into a slightly different direction, but you can go ahead. I can follow.
Okay. Sylvia, does that sound good to you?
Sounds great.
Awesome. I am so inspired. First of all, I just want to like name the great inspiration that I feel in my heart right now. And I feel a lot of connection to something that you're mentioning, which is the limitation of the structures that we're working within. I try to position myself as a co-conspirator in the spaces, especially because I'm working at one of the major museums in Chicago. And I think it's no secret that museums are places of the reification of white supremacy and oppression. And so as a co-conspirator, I try to go in and do some small dismantling work by trying to invite students to arrive in whatever form, vernacular, headspace, whatever they want to be in. But I find I really resonate with that kind of constraint that you had of having a small amount of time to build trust with students. Because in my work with students, I get 1 hour with them. And that's barely enough time to show myself as a trustworthy person, and I'm very fortunate that a lot of the students are very open-minded and like eager to interact. But all that to say is that I think that I would love to hear thoughts about how how to build trust within the constraints of time, without like assuming that like, oh yeah, I have an hour, of course these kids are going to trust me, but like, how do we become closer in trusting each other? And then also like, just if you have any other examples of like working within constraints as a co-conspirator versus we're just working within the constraints of like these larger institutions as a co-conspirator.
I'm going to try not to veer off too hard, but I will like, I guess the short of it is like, when I have very short programming to do, like say an hour workshop, like with the young cultural stewards, 1 hour to play with them on a Saturday, 1 hour to make books with them on a Monday, did not feel like enough time to me either. But I think like, that's okay. Like I don't need them to trust me as much as I need them to trust themselves. Really at the end of the day, like it has to decentralize power. And in order to do
Mhm.
that, like I have to acknowledge that there is a power dynamic at play, which is why I think a lot of the time when I know my time is limited, I try to think of like play engaged activities where I'm removed. I don't manage it. I just set out like umbrella of this is how you play. You can choose to play this way, you can choose to play this way. Let's find different entry points. And then I remove myself from that because I want them at the end of the day to be the ones that are engaged in play. I'm not moving them like chess pieces. I'm allowing them to, through play, find ways of engaging critical thinking skills, community building skills. But I do think that it's important to acknowledge, which is why power, community, and storytelling, I feel like if I was a cloud with hashtags, those would, like those would be the key ones, because I think there has to be a critical understanding of our own identities in the work and in our practices. First and foremost, like, what is my position? I am seen as an adult in a very particular structure, whether it's community work or school work. Like, there's already this idea around like how young folks are supposed to be, how adults are supposed to be. So I think that I have to start by acknowledging like varying power dynamics. And that's why I really love playing Theater of the Oppressed with young folks, because one of the games that we play is A plus B. And then I want to say that I invented, even though I'm sure other people have done this, like A plus B plus X, which allows us to see, and I mean, with the short amount of time we have now, like I can't get into the fullness, but Lucia, you and I can talk.
Yes.
But essentially, like what it does, it literally allows people to view how people at the center with power are in control of the nexus of the outside. And as a result, like some people on the outside get left out. And that allows us to literally embody how power structures work, who's at the center and who's at the margins, and how does that affect the way we play and engage. And I think that's sort of like the longer response. It's like, number one, I got to acknowledge like we only have an hour. I have to have a very clear objective, but I also have to find a way to remove myself from that position of power, where at the end of the day, young folks are central to the work. Young folks are central to the outcome, right? Like this idea that they're going to walk out of here maybe having met a new friend, maybe having learned a technique, maybe realizing that museum spaces, institutional spaces have enough space for them to be able to find themselves. And I have to be okay with that too, that I don't always have to be best friends with the young folks I work with. I just have to be able to provide them with a space, with critical thinking, and I have to be able to approach it with a critical understanding of my own role. And even some of the things that we don't see, right? When we think about differentiated instruction, when we think about students with disabilities, there are some things that are not seen, there are things that are seen, but am I, as an educator, providing multiple entry points for people to be able to access, whether it's 10 weeks or 1 hour?
Yeah, thank you. I feel like that actually like touched on both of the questions that I had in such a beautiful way. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucia. That was a great question. It's a juicy question.
Are there any additional questions for Silvia? If questions do come up, please feel free to convey them, direct them, communicate them to myself, to Dr. Laporte. We will be happy to communicate, relay them to Silvia. But I do want to take a moment to thank you all for being here for the first of two Art Education in Action lecture series talks through the Art Education program at the School of Art at the University of Arkansas. And we really, really want to extend a warm thank you. We have so much gratitude for you, Silvia, today. Thank you so much for sharing your work, your practice, your pedagogical, ideological beliefs with us. Your work is really important. We are so lucky to learn from you. And thank you, Dr. Laporte, for your work organizing the event.
Thanks, everyone. Much appreciated. And I love the questions, and just being able to, like, again, put my work out in words definitely helps me in my reflection process moving forward. So thank you so much for the invite.